3 police cars surrounded my cabin before I even finished my morning coffee, all because of a bird feeder. That's not how anyone expects to start their vacation, but that's exactly how mine began. I was standing on the porch of my late father's lake cabin, breathing in the quiet morning air, when a woman in a pink windbreaker stormed down my dock like she was leading a SWAT raid. Clipboard in one hand, chihuahua tucked under the other, she screamed, "You're violating HOA regulations. Section 4B. Unauthorized environmental interference." Her name was Aria White, and she wasn't just a neighbor, she was the self-appointed queen of Silver Ridge HOA. 10 minutes later, red and blue lights flashed across the water as sirens echoed through the valley. Officers stepped out tense and ready, demanding my ID as if I were some kind of trespasser. That's when I smiled, opened my metal lockbox, and handed them a folded deed proving I didn't just own the cabin, I owned the entire valley Aria was standing on. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and hit subscribe. You won't believe how this story unfolds. The sheriff squinted down at the document in his hands, the morning light bouncing off the gold edges of the county seal. The wind coming off the lake rustled the pages, carrying with it the faint smell of pine and cold water. I watched his expression shift, first confusion, then disbelief, and finally the kind of reluctant respect you only see when someone realizes they've just been standing on the wrong side of authority. "This says you own the entire Silver Ridge Valley?" he asked slowly. I nodded, keeping my voice calm. "That's correct, officer. My father purchased the full tract in 1989. The lake, the shoreline, the surrounding woodlands, all private property. And this cabin sits right in the center of it." Behind him, Aria White let out a sharp laugh, the kind of high-pitched sound that makes dogs bark. "That's ridiculous. No one can own the lake. It's a shared resource under the HOA charter. Section 7C clearly states that." The officer cut her off, still staring at the papers. "Ma'am, this isn't an HOA charter. These are county deeds, water rights, and tax assessments registered in the official land records." He flipped a page and glanced up at me. "You even have riparian rights to the water body itself." Aria's face flushed red under her makeup. "That can't be true. The HOA's been managing this area for years. We have annual meetings, maintenance funds, wildlife policies, then your HOA's been managing my property." I interrupted, my tone steady but edged with steel. "And I'd like that to stop." The silence that followed was thick enough to cut. Even the lake seemed to hold its breath. The sheriff exhaled and handed the papers back. "Far as I can tell, Mr. Roberts, you're not in violation of anything. You're within your rights to hang bird feeders, paint your cabin pink, or build a castle if you want to. This is your land." For a moment, the only sound was the lapping of water against the dock. Then, from behind her oversized sunglasses, Aria glared at me like she was staring at an invading army. "This isn't over," she said through gritted teeth. "You can't just waltz in and rewrite community rules. We have structure here, order, people who respect the system." I smiled faintly. "Then maybe the system should start respecting ownership." She turned sharply on her heel and stormed back toward her golf cart. Yes, she'd driven a golf cart across a gravel road to my property like it was her personal patrol vehicle. Her tiny chihuahua barked once, as if echoing her outrage before disappearing over the hill. The officers exchanged looks. One of them smirked. "Well, Mr. Roberts, looks like you just declared independence from the HOA." I chuckled under my breath. "Guess that makes me the first president of the free state of Silver Ridge." They laughed, wished me luck, and drove off down the winding trail that led back toward the main road. When their taillights vanished, the silence returned, but it wasn't peaceful anymore. It was charged, like the whole valley was holding a secret waiting for what would come next. I walked back toward the cabin, the crunch of gravel beneath my boots, the only sound in the still air. My father's old lockbox still sat open on the porch, the deed papers glowing faintly in the morning. Sunday, I ran a thumb over his signature, Daniel H. Roberts, and for the first time I understood the look in his eyes the last summer we were here together. He wasn't just a man enjoying retirement. He was guarding something. That night I sat by the fire with a notebook replaying the day in my head. The confrontation, the sirens, the shock on Aria's face. But what stuck with me most was her certainty. She believed she was in control. That wasn't arrogance, it was indoctrination, the kind that spreads when nobody questions authority for too long. I decided to check just how far her reach extended. The next morning, I drove into town, a sleepy lakeside community with a diner, a post office, and one small real estate office called White & Associates. The name alone told me everything. Inside, the receptionist looked startled when I mentioned the HOA. "Oh, you mean Mrs. White's committee," she said, lowering her voice. "They've been active lately." Active was an understatement. After a few minutes of polite small talk, I learned that Aria had taken over the Silver Ridge HOA 3 years ago, after the original association dissolved due to lack of interest. No one had ever refiled the paperwork with the county, she just kept using the name. And somehow, through a combination of confidence, paperwork, and intimidation, she'd convinced half the valley that her HOA was still legitimate. She'd built an empire out of nothing but a letterhead. By the time I drove back to the cabin, my initial amusement had hardened into something else: resolve. The first step was to understand the terrain literally. My father had taught me how to read land like a story, every ridge and waterline telling its own history. I hiked along the southern boundary, tracing the rusted old survey markers, half buried under moss. Most were exactly where they should be, except one. Near the creek that fed into the lake, a new post had been hammered in about 30 feet north of the original line. On it hung a shiny metal sign: private HOA property, no trespassing. I laughed out loud. The irony was almost poetic. Someone and I didn't need a detective to guess who had been shifting boundaries to make the HOA map look real. Maybe she thought no one would notice. Maybe she assumed I'd never check. But I wasn't just visiting. I was staying. When I returned to the cabin, I opened my laptop and began cataloging everything: photos, coordinates, time-stamped video of each marker. I uploaded it all to a secure drive. If Aria wanted a war of paperwork, she'd picked the wrong opponent. Over the next few days, the situation escalated in classic HOA fashion, quietly but persistently. Flyers appeared on my truck windshield, accusing me of environmental disruption. A letter arrived in my mailbox with a fine notice of $2,500 for unauthorized shoreline modification. The letterhead bore the HOA logo, a pine tree with a circle around it, printed from what looked like a home inkjet printer. I didn't respond. I waited. 3 days later, a knock echoed on my cabin door. When I opened it, Aria stood there again, clipboard-ready posture, rigid eyes hidden behind reflective shades. "Mr. Roberts," she said, her tone syrupy but sharp, "I'm giving you one last chance to cooperate before we take this to the county." I raised an eyebrow. "Funny. The county already is involved. They confirmed my ownership." She blinked. Just once. Then her lips tightened. "You're making a mistake. This valley belongs to the community." "No," I said softly. "It belongs to whoever pays the property taxes and has the deed, and that's me." Her nostrils flared. "You think you can come here and tear down everything we've built? I think you built it on someone else's land." For a second, she just stood there, breathing hard. Then, without another word, she turned and left the sound of her heels clicking against the wooden porch echoing into the trees. As her golf cart disappeared down the road again, I exhaled slowly and looked out across the water. The surface was calm, glassy, perfect, but somewhere underneath I could sense the current shifting. Aria wasn't the kind of person to back down quietly, and I wasn't the kind of man to give up my father's land. The storm had only just begun. By the fourth day, I realized peace at Silver Ridge was an illusion. The morning air might have been still, but something in the valley had changed, a subtle tension humming beneath the wind. You could feel it in the way the water rippled differently near the docks, like the lake itself was uneasy. I discovered the first sign around noon while hiking the western trail behind my cabin. It was nailed into an old oak tree, shiny aluminum, newly installed, its corners still bright from the hardware store. The text read, "Community Lake Access, property of Silver Ridge HOA." It sat 40 yards inside my boundary line. The nerve. I took a picture, logged the coordinates, and followed the trail down toward the water. I didn't have to look far for the next one. Another sign. Then another. In total, I counted 7 of them spread evenly around the shoreline, each one planted deeper into my land than the last. The final sign was practically in front of my boathouse, just a few steps from my private dock. And that's when I noticed the flyers. Thin, waterproof pages fluttering from the bulletin board by the dock stairs, printed in color, complete with the HOA logo Aria had designed herself. Notice of violation, unauthorized shoreline modifications. Fines pending. Compliance required immediately. At the bottom in bold it said, "Signed Aria White, President Silver Ridge HOA." There was even a fake inspection date stamped on it. I stood there in silence, wind tugging at my flannel sleeve, reading the notice again and again until the absurdity became too much to process. I actually laughed, a dry, disbelieving sound that echoed off the water. This wasn't an HOA trying to enforce community harmony. This was a con artist, staging a coup. Back at the cabin, I set up the trail cameras I'd bought from the hardware store in town, 4 in total, each with infrared sensors and high-capacity SD cards. I mounted one facing the main path, another overlooking the dock, and two more near the tree line where the boundary markers stood. If Arya wanted to play the surveillance game, I could play better. That evening, as the sun dipped behind the ridgeline, I spotted movement near the far bank. A small figure in a pink jacket pacing back and forth with a flashlight beam dancing across the ground. I zoomed in through my binoculars. It was Arya, clipboard under her arm, phone held to her ear, muttering as she pointed at my dock. She stayed there for nearly 10 minutes before retreating toward her property. I knew then that she wasn't done. She was planning something. The next morning I received an envelope slid under my cabin door. No postage, no return address. Inside was a formal complaint written in aggressive legal language accusing me of willfully endangering wildlife habitats and unauthorized construction of shoreline structures. The letter threatened escalated legal action and daily fines up to $10,000. At the bottom, printed in bold letters, was a mock seal that read, Silver Ridge Homeowners Environmental Council. A council that didn't exist. I couldn't help but marvel at her audacity. She'd created an entire fake bureaucracy out of thin air, and apparently some of my neighbors believed it. Later that afternoon, I drove around the lake road to buy supplies and noticed something strange. At least 5 homes had her flyers taped to their mailboxes, warning residents to avoid contact with the non-compliant property owner at Lot 3 Amperes. That was me. My name was listed in full. It wasn't just harassment anymore. It was defamation. When I returned home, a group of deer scattered from my driveway, and that's when I saw it. Another brand new sign staked right into the gravel beside my front gate, under investigation by Silver Ridge HOA. Entry restricted. It was too much. I pulled it out of the ground, tossed it into the truck bed, and drove straight to the county office. The clerk, a middle-aged man with reading glasses and a name tag that said Morris, looked exhausted the second I mentioned Arya White. He rubbed his temples and sighed. "You're not the first," he muttered. "That woman's filed 6 separate complaints in the last 2 weeks. Noise violations, environmental hazards, you name it. Every one of them dismissed." He leaned back in his chair. "She's got a reputation, Mr. Roberts. Used to be in charge of an HOA down by Copper Creek. Got dissolved after she fined half the neighborhood into rebellion. I'm guessing she came here to start fresh." I raised an eyebrow. "Fresh or fraudulent, both," he said dryly. Morris pulled up my land file, confirmed that my deed and water rights were clear, then offered to put an official note in the record declaring that no HOA had jurisdiction over my property. "Won't stop her from trying," he warned, "but it'll make things easier if she calls the cops again." That night, I reviewed the footage from my trail cams. For the first few hours, nothing, just raccoons, wind, and the occasional flash of deer eyes. Then around 11:37 p.m. motion alert triggered. The grainy footage showed a small figure walking down the path, flashlight in one hand, roll of tape in the other. It was her, Arya White, creeping along my boundary, stopping every few trees to staple a new flyer. She kept glancing toward the camera, the obvious one I'd placed on the main path, but what she didn't know was that I'd set a second hidden one 20 feet back, aimed directly at her. The footage was perfect. Color time-stamped, crystal clear. She wasn't just trespassing, she was fabricating evidence. I backed up the footage, uploaded it to the cloud, and emailed a copy to myself and my attorney. Then I poured a glass of whiskey, stepped out onto the porch, and stared at the water under the moonlight. The reflection of the stars danced across the lake, rippling with every breath of wind. It was the kind of beauty my father had loved. Quiet, untamed, untouched by politics. I wondered what he'd think of this chaos. Probably laugh then, tell me to outsmart her instead of out-yelling her, so that's what I decided to do. The next morning I drafted a cease and desist letter, formal, legally phrased and backed by state trespass laws. I cited every relevant statute, attached GPS coordinates, and listed the dates and times her activities were recorded. I printed 2 copies, one for her, one for the sheriff's office. By mid-morning I walked down the dirt road to her property. The air smelled faintly of lavender and lake moss, the strange mix that always hung around her manicured lawn. Arya's house sat on the far ridge, a modern 2-story glass structure that looked wildly out of place among the pines. Her porch lights flicked on as I approached. She opened the door in a silk-robed towel on her head, face half covered in a green mud mask. The chihuahua barked from somewhere behind her. I handed her the envelope. "Consider this a warning," I said evenly. "You step on my land again, you'll be dealing with the sheriff, not me." For a moment she looked stunned, vulnerable even. Then her eyes narrowed. "You think you can intimidate me?" she hissed. "I've run this community for 3 years. I know every regulation, every official in this county. I'm sure you do, I said calmly, but I know every inch of this land, and that's the only thing that matters. Her lips twisted into something between a smirk and a snarl. You'll regret this, she whispered. No one defies the HOA. I didn't respond. I simply nodded, once turned and walked back toward the road. The gravel crunched under my boots, echoing through the silence like punctuation marks at the end of a chapter. When I reached the cabin, I saw the sheriff's cruiser parked near my dock, the same officer from before leaning casually against his door, arms crossed. Morning, Mr. Roberts, he said. Guess who just called us again, I sighed. Let me guess, environmental terrorism, he chuckled. Close. She says you threatened her, but we already reviewed the footage you sent last night. He tapped his tablet. Crystal clear trespassing fake notices the works. I'll be paying her a visit later today. Thanks, officer, I said, shaking his hand. He tipped his hat. Off the record, Mr. Roberts, you've got patience I couldn't dream of. But keep your cameras rolling. Something tells me this woman doesn't know when to quit. He was right. Because as he drove away, I noticed something glinting on the far hill, a flash of light catching the morning Sunday. I lifted my binoculars. It was a drone, hovering directly above my cabin, watching. Arya White had just declared war, and this time she'd taken it to the sky. The drone buzzed like an angry hornet over my cabin, slicing through the quiet morning air. Its reflection shimmered across the surface of the lake, circling lazily as if studying every inch of my property. For a few seconds, I just stood there on the porch, coffee forgotten in my hand, watching the lens tilt down toward me like a single unblinking eye. I didn't need to guess who was behind it. Good morning to you too, Arya, I muttered. I'd seen enough surveillance toys to know this wasn't some cheap hobby drone. This was high-end, the kind contractors use for topography or film crews use for real estate videos. A small sticker near the propeller even read White & Associates Property Management. She had branded it. I walked calmly back inside, grabbed my binoculars and tracked it as it drifted toward the north ridge straight to her house. The drone landed neatly on her deck railing where she stood, waiting still in her bright pink jacket, watching through binoculars of her own. It was official. She'd escalated from trespassing to aerial harassment. That afternoon, I drove into town again. This time I went to the county environmental office where I met a wiry man named Landon Pierce, an inspector with 20 years of experience and an expression that said he'd seen every flavor of rural nonsense imaginable. I explained the situation, the fake HOA, the drones, the fabricated notices, and the signs hammered into my land. Landon listened silently, jotting down notes in a small black notebook. When I showed him the video of Arya planting flyers, he leaned back in his chair and gave a low whistle. She's crossed about 5 different lines here, he said finally. Unauthorized signage, falsified documentation, and that drone. If she's filming you on your private property, that's a violation of privacy under the state's remote surveillance law. He pulled up my property file on his screen and frowned. And get this, she's submitted 3 environmental complaints against you already. All denied, of course. The last one accused you of poisoning the lake. I laughed. With what birdseed, he smirked. Probably. Don't worry. I'll file an official report. You'll have it on record by tomorrow. By the time I drove back, the sun was setting behind the mountains, turning the lake into a sheet of molten gold. But the peace didn't last long. As I turned into my driveway, I spotted 2 men by the shore, strangers, wearing construction vests, measuring something near my dock. I pulled up beside them. Can I help you, gentlemen? One of them turned. We're here for the HOA inspection, sir. Got a work order signed by President White. I smiled tightly. You might want to read the fine print before you step another foot. I pointed to the edge of the dock where I'd posted one of my private property signs right next to the county's official land boundary marker. Then I took out my phone, opened the camera app, and started recording. Go ahead, I said. Tell me again who sent you. The men exchanged nervous looks. We were just following instructions. Didn't know it was private. Now you do, I said. You've got 30 seconds. They didn't argue. Within a minute they were gone, tires spraying gravel down the road as they sped off. I stood there for a while, the wind blowing cold across the water, trying to understand what her endgame was. She wasn't just enforcing fake rules anymore, she was building a narrative. Each flyer, each photo, each inspection was another brick in the illusion that she controlled this place. But illusions crumble under evidence. The next morning I hiked along the creek that fed into the lake. I wanted to check something Landon had mentioned. The water flow levels seemed off. Sure enough, about half a mile upstream, I found a makeshift dam of rocks and timber wedged between 2 banks. It wasn't large, but it was enough to slow the current. The edges were fresh, moss still scraped off, and right next to it, nailed into a tree, was another sign, protected wetland zone, managed by Silver Ridge HOA. I crouched, ran my fingers through the water, and felt the sediment building up along the bank. Her dam was raising the lake level inch by inch. If she kept it up, the overflow would eventually erode the base of my southern slope and flood the lower yard. That wasn't just trespassing. That was environmental tampering. I took photos, video measurements, everything. Then I drove straight back and sent the files to Landon. He called me that evening, sounding almost excited. "This is solid," he said. "We'll send an officer to inspect tomorrow. If she built that without a county permit, she's looking at serious fines." The next day, I was sitting on my porch when a white pickup truck with the County Environmental Division logo rolled up. Landon stepped out with a clipboard and another officer, both wearing neon vests. Aria must have spotted them from across the water, because 10 minutes later, she came marching down the hill toward us, heels, stabbing into the dirt like she was conquering Rome. "What is this?" she demanded. "You can't just barge onto community property without authorization from the HOA." Landon looked at her evenly. "Ma'am, this isn't community property. It's privately owned land belonging to Mr. Roberts. And we're here under county jurisdiction, not yours." Her mouth fell open. "That's outrageous. I've managed this shoreline for 3 years. I have documents." "Then you won't mind showing them," Landon said coolly. Aria froze. Her eyes flicked to me, then back to Landon. "They're being processed." "Right," he said. "Then while you wait for the paperwork to process, we'll just go ahead and process this." He gestured toward the dam, took a few photos, and jotted notes. "Unpermitted alteration of a natural watercourse, potential sediment blockage, violation of Riparian Code 712C. He turned back to Aria. "You'll be receiving a notice of violation within 72 hours. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of fury and disbelief. For the first time, she didn't have a snappy comeback. She turned toward me, voice trembling with rage. "You think this means you've won? You have no idea what kind of influence I have in this valley." I folded my arms. "Then I guess it's time the valley found out who really owns it." She spun around and stormed off, muttering something about lawyers and connections. After the officials left, I sat on the porch again, staring across the lake. Her house, all glass and angles, reflected the fading sun like a mirror of arrogance. I should have felt triumphant, but I didn't. I knew her type. Losing one battle only made her more dangerous. Sure enough, that night, at exactly 2:14 a.m., my phone buzzed with a motion alert. I opened the feed from my trail camera and froze. Aria was back. She wore dark clothes, a headlamp, and carried a hammer. She crouched near the dock, ripping one of my boundary markers out of the ground. Then she took a photo of the hole, probably to claim I had damaged it. But the second camera, the one hidden behind the tree, caught everything from a perfect angle. The next morning I didn't call her, and I didn't call Landon. I went straight to the sheriff's office. The deputy on duty reviewed the footage, sighed, and said, "She's pushing her luck, Mr. Roberts. This qualifies as criminal mischief and trespassing." "Will you arrest her?" I asked. He shook his head. "Not yet, but we'll have a word. She's on thin ice." When I drove home, I spotted her standing on her deck again, arms crossed, staring across the lake at me. Her drone hovered beside her, motionless, like a metal vulture. I raised my phone, aimed it at the sky, and pressed record. The drone tilted, almost hesitating, before it turned and flew back toward her property. That night, as I sat by the firelight, a realization settled over me. This wasn't about property anymore. It was about control. Aria didn't care who legally owned the valley. She cared that she wasn't the one in charge. But control has its limits, and mine was written in ink, signed, sealed, and stamped by the county. If she wanted to keep fighting, I'd give her something she couldn't manipulate the truth in public. The next morning, I called my attorney. It was time to take this feud to the courthouse and show everyone in Silver Ridge just how fake Aria's little empire really was. By the time the court hearing date arrived, the air around Silver Ridge felt electric heavy, with tension, whispers, and speculation. Word had spread like wildfire through the valley. Neighbors who used to wave politely from their porches now slowed their cars when passing my cabin, curious about the man who dared to challenge Aria, White Queen of the HOA. I woke up early that morning dressed in my best button-down and loaded the truck with folders, deeds, maps, photos, drone footage, timestamps, and video evidence. Everything meticulously organized in labeled envelopes. My attorney, Mason Hale, was already waiting outside the county courthouse when I arrived, leaning casually against his silver sedan. Mason was calm, sharp-eyed, and the kind of man who could dismantle a liar with a single sentence. "Morning, Timothy," he said, shaking my hand. You ready to put a crown on this circus? Only if we can make her abdicate first, I replied, half grinning. He chuckled. Don't worry, we'll make it quick. Inside the courtroom, the scene looked more like a town hall than a legal proceeding. At least 20 locals had shown up, homeowners, retirees, even a few teenagers who clearly had no idea what was going on but didn't want to miss the show. Arya sat near the front, flanked by two people who looked like reluctant allies, a real estate broker and her so-called community treasurer. She was dressed for war. Beige power suit, pearl earrings, immaculate makeup. Her hair looked like it had been sculpted by pure spite. When she saw me walk in, she leaned over to her companion and whispered something behind her hand, smiling in that tight, artificial way that only a politician or a predator can manage. The county officer presiding over the case, a man named Judge Harris, though this was technically a zoning review, called the room to order. We are here to address allegations of encroachment, environmental interference, and fraudulent representation concerning the Silver Ridge HOA and the property owned by Mr. Timothy Roberts. Arya stood immediately, voice firm and dramatic. Your Honor, before we begin, I'd like to note that this man has been disrupting community harmony for months. He's endangered wildlife, polluted our lake, and erected illegal structures in a protected zone. Miss White. Judge Harris interrupted, raising a hand. Please sit down. You will have your turn. Her mouth snapped shut, but her glare could have set paper on fire. Mason stood unhurried, calm as ever. Your Honor, this is quite simple. My client owns 260 acres of private land that encompasses Silver Ridge Valley, including the lake, the shoreline, and all surrounding trails. Miss White, despite having no legal authority or standing, has repeatedly harassed him, forged documents, and tampered with environmental features on his property. He handed a thick folder to the clerk. Here is the evidence-certified deed copies, tax records, and GPS-verified footage. Judge Harris flipped through the first few pages, his eyebrows rising slightly. This appears legitimate, he murmured. Arya shot to her feet again. Those documents could be fabricated. The HOA has been managing this community for 3 years, under a charter signed by multiple residents. Mason's expression didn't change. A charter, Your Honor, which according to county records was never filed, recorded, or recognized as a legal entity. What Miss White operates is at best a volunteer club, at worst a fraudulent organization collecting fees under false pretenses. A murmur rippled through the room. Someone in the back whispered, "Wait, it's not even real." Arya's face went crimson. That's a lie, I have proof. She yanked a folder from her briefcase and marched toward the clerk's table, slapping the papers down with theatrical force. Here, the HOA bylaws, membership agreements, and community votes. Judge Harris scanned them briefly, then frowned. Miss White, these documents are printed on personal letterhead. There are no registration numbers, no county stamps, and this seal appears to be drawn in pen. It's symbolic, she snapped. The courtroom erupted in chuckles. Even the clerk bit back a smile. Mason waited a beat, then stepped forward. Your Honor, I'd also like to introduce additional evidence. He turned on a small projector connected to his laptop. The lights dimmed, and on the wall appeared a crystal-clear image from my trail camera. Arya, in her pink windbreaker, caught mid-step as she taped a fake violation notice to one of my trees. Gasps filled the room. Another image appeared, her crouching by the shoreline, hammering a sign that read, HOA property, no trespassing. And finally, a short video, Arya at 2:14 a.m., flashlight in hand, prying up a boundary stake while muttering to herself. The timestamp glowed in the corner. Judge Harris watched in silence. Then he looked up. Miss White, do you deny this is you? Arya's composure cracked. That's taken out of context. I was checking community boundaries for safety reasons. Mason clicked his remote again. A new clip appeared, Arya looking directly into the camera lens and whispering, "He'll regret ever moving here." The laughter this time was louder. Someone even clapped before the judge banged his gavel for order. I didn't smile. I just watched her crumble piece by piece like a porcelain doll dropped on marble. Judge Harris leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Miss White, this court finds clear evidence of trespassing, falsified documentation, and harassment. The so-called Silver Ridge HOA holds no legal standing or jurisdiction. You are hereby ordered to cease all operations immediately and remove any signage or structures placed on Mr. Roberts' land. Her mouth opened, then closed. She looked around the room as if searching for an ally, but all the faces that once looked at her with deference now looked away. Harris wasn't done. Furthermore, you will be fined for unauthorized alteration of a watercourse, the dam built upstream and subject to inspection for environmental restoration. Arya gasped. "You can't do this. You don't understand. This valley needs order. Without me, it'll fall apart." The judge gave her a long, measured look. "Order doesn't come from control, Miss White. It comes from respect. Something you seem to have forgotten." He slammed the gavel once. Hearing adjourned. The moment the sound echoed through the room, Arya's facade finally cracked. Her shoulders slumped, her hands trembled, and for the first time, she looked small, not like a tyrant, but like someone who just realized her empire was built on air. Mason packed up the files, turned to me, and said quietly, "She'll try something else. People like her always do." I nodded. "Then we'll be ready." Outside, the autumn wind cut sharp across the courthouse steps. Arya stormed past us without a word, her heels clicking furiously against the concrete. The pink jacket was gone, replaced by a dull gray coat that looked almost funereal. A few of her former supporters lingered nearby. One of them, Doug, a retired surveyor who'd been one of her earliest recruits, walked up and said, "Mr. Roberts, I owe you an apology. She told us the HOA was county approved. We just wanted to keep the lake clean, not this." I smiled faintly. "You don't owe me anything, Doug. But maybe next time, make sure your leaders aren't writing their own laws." He nodded, embarrassed but grateful. That night back at the cabin, the lake was still. No drones, no signs, no headlights creeping along the ridge. For the first time in weeks, I heard nothing but the sound of water lapping against the dock and the soft hum of crickets. I sat on the porch with a whiskey glass in hand, the firelight flickering beside me. For a moment, I almost believed it was over. But deep down, I knew better, because Arya White wasn't the type to surrender quietly. And if I'd learned anything from this war, it was that silence wasn't peace, it was the calm before the next storm. I should have known peace wouldn't last long. People like Arya White didn't just lose, they plotted. They lingered in the dark, waiting for a chance to twist the narrative to claw back control from the jaws of humiliation. For a few days after the hearing, the valley fell eerily quiet. No flyers, no phone calls, no drones buzzing over my roof. The only sound was the wind rustling through the pines and the occasional splash of fish breaking the surface of the lake. I spent the time fixing the fence along the southern trail, patching up the holes where her fake HOA signs had once hung. It almost felt normal. Then, on the fifth morning, I woke to find a wooden board nailed to my front gate. Thick red letters painted in haste screamed, "Community Watch Zone. Trespassers will be photographed and prosecuted." And in smaller handwriting beneath it, "Report suspicious activity. The Outsider." The Outsider. I stood there for a full minute reading it under the pale light of dawn. The handwriting was unmistakable, sharp, jagged, and dripping with frustration. She wasn't trying to scare me this time. She was trying to rally people again. Arya was rebuilding her army. I tore down the sign and tossed it into the back of my truck. Then I walked back to the porch, coffee mug in hand, staring out at the calm surface of the lake. Everything looked the same, too much the same. When I checked the trail cameras later that morning, I found proof that someone had been back on my land again. The footage, time-stamped at 1:47 a.m., showed a figure creeping along the boundary path behind my cabin. It was Arya, dark hoodie, gloves, and flashlight. She stopped near the tree line, crouched low, and began pulling something from the ground. Survey stakes. The same markers the county had placed after the hearing. I froze the frame. There was no mistaking her face when she looked up at the lens, eyes wide and defiant, like she knew she was being watched and didn't care. I forwarded the footage to the sheriff's office within minutes. Later that afternoon, Deputy Cole showed up at my property, same officer who'd handled her earlier trespassing report. He had the weary expression of a man who'd been dealing with small-town drama for too many years. "Morning, Mr. Roberts," he said, tipping his hat. "Got your email. That woman's making quite a name for herself down at the station." "Let me guess," I said. "She's denying it again," he nodded. "Claims the footage was doctored. Says you're running a smear campaign to destroy her reputation." I couldn't help but laugh. If she's worried about her reputation, maybe she should stop committing crimes on camera. Cole sighed. "I agree, but until we catch her in the act, it's a civil headache. You know how it is. I can file a harassment warning, though, officially this time." "Do it," I said. When he left, I decided it was time to take this war into my own hands. Enough playing defense. That night, I stayed up late, setting up a new line of motion sensor lights around the cabin perimeter, powerful ones that could light up half the ridge. I also upgraded my cameras to send live push notifications straight to my phone. If she so much as set foot near my land again, I'd know instantly. It didn't take long. 2 nights later, at exactly 1:32 a.m., my phone buzzed. Motion detected. I opened the live feed, and my jaw tightened. There she was, creeping along the east ridge near my dock. The floodlights triggered instantly, blasting the darkness into day. Arya froze like a deer caught in headlights, her hoodie half-zipped, a hammer in one hand and a crowbar in the other. For one surreal moment, our eyes met through the lens, her face twisting from shock to pure rage. Then she turned and bolted, but I'd already called the sheriff. By the time 2 cruisers arrived, the valley echoed with the sound of sirens again, just like the day it all started. I watched from the porch as the red and blue lights danced against the lake water, reflecting across the trees like restless ghosts. The officers combed the area and found what she'd been working on: several boundary stakes, uprooted, one camera smashed, and one side of my observation deck, the new one I'd built after the hearing, completely torn down. Broken boards, bent nails, a mess of splinters. They photographed everything, took statements, and promised to follow up. I could tell they were tired of this feud as much as I was. The next morning I received the official report: criminal mischief, property damage, trespassing, and harassment. But there was more. Deputy Cole called personally. She's being questioned downtown. Looks like this time she can't squirm out of it. We've got enough to press charges if you want. I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I wanted anymore, justice or peace. Maybe both. Press them, I said finally, and make sure she stays off my property. He promised to handle it. By noon, word had spread again. I saw neighbors walking their dogs slower than usual, glancing my way, pretending not to stare. One even stopped by Doug, the retired surveyor, carrying a toolbox. "Thought you could use a hand fixing that deck," he said, smiling awkwardly. I nodded gratefully. "Appreciate it, Doug. Didn't think this mess would ever end." He chuckled. "Arya's been a thorn in everyone's side for years. You just happened to be the one who didn't bow." We spent the afternoon repairing the deck, hammering boards in silence, except for the rhythmic thud of nails. It felt good, grounding. For the first time in months, someone wasn't just avoiding me, they were helping. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the lake orange, I sat on the porch watching the reflection shimmer like molten fire. It was quiet again, the kind of quiet I used to love. Then came the sound of gravel crunching. I turned and saw a white county vehicle pull up near my gate. A man stepped out, khaki uniform, clipboard in hand. He looked official, but something about his posture seemed uneasy. "Mr. Roberts," he called. "I'm with County Code Enforcement. We received an anonymous complaint about unauthorized construction near the shoreline." "Of course." "Let me guess," I said. "Same caller as before." He gave a wry smile. "Probably. But I still have to take a look." "Be my guest," I said, leading him toward the deck. He examined the repairs, checked the supports, and looked at the permits I kept laminated by the door. After a few minutes, he shook his head and laughed softly. "This is fine, completely legal. Whoever keeps reporting you has way too much time on their hands." "Try obsession," I said. He nodded. "Well, you're clear. I'll file a dismissal report tonight." As he drove off, I noticed movement across the lake, a flicker of light from Arya's window. Curtains parted for just a second, revealing her silhouette. She was watching me, but her house looked different now, quieter. Fewer lights on fewer cars in the driveway. Word was spreading that the county might revoke her property rights over the illegal deck still hanging over my land. Her empire was collapsing. I thought that might be the end of it. But then 1 week later, the final act of her madness arrived. A thick envelope appeared in my mailbox, no return address, just my name, typed neatly on the front. Inside was a petition printed on glossy paper with 20 signatures. Emergency action to remove unauthorized structures and restore Silver Ridge to community oversight. At the bottom in bold, submitted by Arya White, Community Defense Coordinator. She was doing it again, trying to resurrect her fake HOA under a new name, hiding behind the language of environmental protection. I stared at the paper, feeling a mix of disbelief and exhaustion. Then something on the back caught my eye, a list of names. Half of them were crossed out, some with handwritten notes beside them. Refused. No response. Threatened to call cops. Her support was dwindling. She was running out of soldiers. That night I climbed my newly repaired deck and looked across the water. Arya's house was dark. The reflection of the stars shimmered on the lake, but her windows were black, no movement, no light. Maybe she'd finally realized what I had from the start: you can't control a valley that doesn't belong to you. Still, deep down, I knew this wasn't her final move. People like her never just walk away. They retreat, wait, and then strike when no one's watching. And sure enough, when I checked the trail cams the next morning, I found the proof: one last shadow near the dock, just before dawn. A woman in black, her face turned away from the camera, holding something long and metallic in her hands. A crowbar. Arya White wasn't finished. Not yet. The morning after that footage, I didn't sleep. My coffee went cold as I replayed the clip over and over, the shadowed figure creeping by the dock, the glint of metal in her hand, the unmistakable way she turned her head just enough for moonlight to reveal the edge of her cheekbone. It was Arya White, no question. The same woman who'd been fined, exposed, humiliated, and now apparently was willing to cross the line from nuisance to criminal. By sunrise, I'd already called the sheriff's office. Deputy Cole picked up on the second ring, his voice gravelly from too many late nights. "What's she done now?" he asked, before I even spoke. "I've got her on camera again," I said flatly. "This time with a crowbar. Around 4:30 in the morning. I think she was trying to get to my boathouse." He sighed deep and weary. "Send me the footage." "We'll pay her a visit. Make it quick," I said. "She's getting desperate." He didn't argue. Within an hour, the cruiser lights were visible down the Ridge Road. I stood on my porch and watched as the deputies crossed the bridge toward her property. From my vantage point, I could see her glass house shimmering in the morning light, silent and perfect like a trophy case. It stayed that way for about 10 minutes. Then I heard shouting. Her voice shrill, panicked, indignant, carried easily over the lake. "You can't accuse me of that. You're harassing a community leader," she screamed. I couldn't hear the officer's reply, but I saw the door slam open, and Arya stumbled out onto her deck, arms flailing as she gestured wildly toward my cabin. The reflection of the lake distorted her silhouette, making her look even more unhinged, a queen railing against a kingdom that no longer existed. A few moments later, one of the deputies gently took her by the arm and led her down the steps. She didn't resist, but the fury in her eyes burned across the water like lightning. By noon, she was gone. Cole called that evening. "We didn't arrest her, but we did issue an official restraining order. She's not allowed within 300 feet of your property, Mr. Roberts. One more incident and she'll be in cuffs." "Appreciate it," I said. "You think that'll stop her?" He chuckled darkly. "People like that. They stop when they run out of an audience. Looks like the valley's finally done clapping." He was right, mostly. For the next week, the silence was deafening. The lake had never looked so peaceful, so unbothered. The trees around the shoreline were turning gold with early autumn, and the air carried that crisp, earthy smell of pine needles and cool water. I almost convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, it was over. Then came the storm. Literally. A violent thunderstorm rolled in one night, without warning, wind howling down from the mountains, and rain hammering against the windows so hard it sounded like gravel. I was upstairs checking the attic when I heard it, a heavy crack from outside, followed by the unmistakable groan of splintering wood. Lightning flashed, illuminating the yard for half a second, just long enough for me to see it, the observation deck collapsing into the lake. I ran out into the rain boots, sinking into the mud. The deck was gone, half of it ripped clean from its supports, the other half dangling by bent bolts and splintered beams. I waded knee-deep into the shallows and spotted the cause almost instantly. Someone had cut through the base supports with a saw. Not wind, not weather, deliberate sabotage. Even through the pounding rain, I felt that familiar surge of cold fury rise through my chest. There was only one person who could have done this. The next morning, once the sky cleared and the water calmed, I surveyed the damage with my camera in hand. The saw marks were fresh, less than 12 hours old. My trail cams were destroyed, every single one, smashed or stolen, except one hidden on a nearby pine tree facing the dock. When I pulled the SD card and checked it on my laptop, my hands tightened on the keyboard. There she was. Arya White, soaked to the bone in her black hoodie, cutting through the deck supports like a woman possessed. The timestamp read 2:06 a.m. The lightning had illuminated her face for a single frame, enough to remove any doubt. This time, I didn't just email the footage. I drove straight to the sheriff's department, walked in, drenched from rain and mud, and dropped the flash drive on Cole's desk. "She's done," I said. "No more warnings." Cole nodded grimly. "We'll take it from here." That afternoon, 2 cruisers and a county truck arrived at her house. I didn't follow, but the sound of raised voices carried across the valley. Again, hers frantic and broken this time. I didn't celebrate when the news reached me that she'd been charged with criminal mischief, destruction of property, and violation of a court order. I didn't even smile when they towed away her car. Instead, I sat by the water and watched the clouds roll across the mountains. It wasn't victory, I felt it was relief, the heavy kind that sits on your shoulders after months of holding your ground. 2 days later, I was repairing the dock when I saw a small convoy of cars coming down the Ridge Road. Neighbors. Doug was in front, followed by Rose, the quiet widow who lived by the creek, and a handful of others. They brought tools, planks, even food. Doug waved, heard what happened, figured we'd lend a hand. "You kept this valley from becoming her playground. Least we can do is help fix what she broke." I didn't know what to say for a moment. Then I simply nodded. Let's get to work. For hours, the sound of hammering laughter and conversation filled the air, the kind of genuine community noise Arya had always pretended to create. Rose made sandwiches and coffee. Doug retold the story of how Arya once fined him for having the wrong shade of mailbox, and even the teenagers from the far side of the lake showed up with fresh boards. By sunset, the new deck was stronger than before, wide, sturdy, and gleaming golden under the fading light. That evening, as everyone packed up to head home, Doug stayed behind. He leaned against the railing, watching the reflection of the sky ripple across the water. You know, he said, I worked on her house when it was being built. Beautiful place, but she kept adding things she didn't need. Bigger windows, taller walls, more lights. She said she wanted to own the view. I told her you can't own a view. You just borrow it for a while. I smiled faintly. Guess she never learned that. Doug nodded. Guess you did. After he left, I sat on the deck alone. The night air was cool, the moon rising bright over the ridge. Across the lake, Arya's house sat dark. No lights, no sound. Rumor was she'd been ordered to vacate pending the charges, maybe even sell. I thought that would bring me satisfaction, but it didn't. It just made me sad, not for her exactly, but for what control can do to people. How it corrodes reason, turns neighbors into enemies. I poured a drink and looked out over the lake, the reflection of the stars rippling in the water. That's when my phone buzzed a message from Mason, my lawyer. County hearing complete. Her deck officially declared encroachment. You now own full rights to her shoreline parcel. Congratulations. I stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, thanks. Let's make it official. It was poetic, really. The woman who'd tried to claim the valley as hers was now being evicted from land that legally belonged to me. As I shut off my phone and leaned back against the railing, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of pine and distant rain. For the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. Not because I'd won, but because the valley was finally quiet. The mountain, my father used to say, always chooses who gets to stay, and this time it had chosen me. Winter came early that year, the kind of cold that slips quietly through the trees before anyone's ready for it. One morning I woke to find a thin layer of frost glittering across the grass like powdered glass, the lake rimmed with ice along the shallows. The air was still sharp and pure, untouched by noise, by sirens, by drama. For the first time in nearly a year, Silver Ridge Valley was silent. Truly silent. Arya White was gone. After the last hearing, she'd been forced to vacate her property under a court order. Her house, once a glowing monument of self-importance, now stood dark and empty across the lake. The bank foreclosed on it after she failed to pay the environmental fines. A for sale sign leaned crooked against the driveway, half buried in snow. I thought that would be the end of it, and for a while it was. Then, about 2 weeks before Christmas, I got a call from a real estate agent named Calvin Brooks. His voice was polite, professional, the kind of tone that always precedes a pitch. Mr. Roberts, he said, I'm handling a private sale for the property formerly owned by Miss Arya White. I was told you might be interested in expanding your holdings in the valley. I nearly laughed. I already own the valley, Mr. Brooks. He chuckled nervously. Of course, sir. But this would formalize full control of the northern ridge and the adjoining parcel near the lake. I'm told you've had prior complications with the previous owner. Complications, I repeated dryly. That's one way to put it. The truth was, I hadn't even thought about buying her house. It wasn't out of spite, I just didn't need it. The land was already mine by boundary law. But something about his phrasing, formalized full control, stuck with me. How much, I asked. He told me the number. It was high for a property with a ruined deck pending environmental fees and a bad reputation. But I had the means, and more importantly, the reason. 2 weeks later, it was mine. When the papers were signed, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't even feel relief. What I felt was something quieter, a deep, settled calm, like the valley itself had exhaled after holding its breath for far too long. The first thing I did was walk through her house. Dust covered everything. The once bright windows were streaked with grime, the hardwood floors warped from moisture. In the living room, a stack of half-torn HOA violation forms sat on the counter, curling with age. It felt like walking through the remnants of a delusion, a kingdom that had crumbled the moment its queen fell. Upstairs, I found her old office. On the desk sat a cracked coffee mug that read, I make the rules. Beside it, a pile of neatly labeled folders, fines, complaints, surveillance logs, enforcement actions. Every document was hand-typed, stamped with her fake HOA seal. I sat down in her chair and flipped through the papers. It was absurd, a paper empire built on control and paranoia. There were notes about me, too. detailed ones. Dates, photos, even printed screenshots from when her drone had filmed my property. For a moment, I just stared at the pile, half angry, half fascinated. How far could someone go just to feel powerful? Then I gathered it all, carried it to the fireplace, and watched it burn. When the last page curled into ash, I felt something uncoil inside me. Not vengeance, not victory, just release. Over the next month, I started restoring the place. Not as a home, but as a retreat. I ripped out the sterile decor, opened the windows, and let the cold mountain air sweep through every room. The sound of the lake drifted in with it, soft waves lapping against the shore, like the valley was singing again. Doug and Rose came by one weekend to help. "So what's the plan for the house?" Doug asked, hauling in a plank of wood for the new deck. "I'm turning it into something useful," I said. "A place for people who actually care about this land. Hikers, volunteers, veterans, anyone who needs peace." Rose smiled. "A community without an HOA. I like that." We called it the Lookout Lodge, a simple open space where anyone could stay for free. No rules, no politics, just respect for the valley and its nature. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same land Arya once used to threaten her neighbors now existed to bring them together. At first, I only had a few visitors. A retired firefighter from Denver, a young writer from Oregon who needed solitude, a father and son who'd lost their home in a flood. They came, stayed a few nights, and left letters behind, small notes of gratitude, stories of healing, sketches of the lake. One letter, though, hit me hardest. It was from a woman who'd lived under Arya's rule for years. "You probably don't remember me," she wrote. I was the one she fined for hanging wind chimes. I stopped sitting outside because I was afraid she'd complain about the noise. Now, for the first time in years, I can sit by the water and just breathe. Thank you. I read that note 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in my father's old journal, the one he used when he first mapped this land. Somehow, it felt right to keep them together. By spring, the lodge had become something more than a building. It was a symbol not of ownership, but of freedom. People stopped seeing me as the man who fought the HOA and started seeing me as the man who gave the valley back to itself. Then, one afternoon while clearing brush near the old trail, I found something that made me stop in my tracks. A rusted metal stake half buried in the dirt. One of the original boundary markers from the 1,982nd survey, the same kind Arya had tried to move months ago. The paint was flaking off, but 3 letters were still visible: D-H-R. My father's initials. I brushed away the dirt, staring at it for a long time. It felt like a message from him, one last reminder of why he'd left me this place. To protect it. Not from people like Arya, not even from time, but from the kind of corruption that turns beauty into ownership. That night, I climbed the lookout tower. The same tower that had once sparked so much outrage now stood taller than ever, rebuilt, with new timber and reinforced steel. From the top, I could see everything: the lodge lights glowing softly through the trees, the lake reflecting the silver sky, the empty house across the ridge. The wind was cold, steady, alive. "This is home," I whispered into the air. Not because I bought it, not because I won it, but because I earned it. Somewhere below, a family staying at the lodge started laughing, the kind of laughter that carries across water and stays in the air. It echoed through the valley like the sound of life returning. For the first time since this all began, I smiled without bitterness. The valley no longer belonged to an HOA charter or a false queen. It belonged to the people who respected it, who listened to it. And to me, not as its ruler, but as its caretaker. As the stars blinked awake above the ridge, I felt the wind shift, soft, forgiving, and final. The mountain had tested me, shaped me, and in its quiet way accepted me. The war was over. The valley was free. Sometimes life gives us people like Arya White, loud, controlling, and convinced they know what's best for everyone. They build walls of rules and call it order. But real peace doesn't come from control. It comes from respect. Standing your ground doesn't always mean fighting with fists or anger. Sometimes it means patience, truth, and knowing that time, like the mountain, is always on the side of what's right. So if someone ever tries to take what's yours, your peace, your freedom, your home, don't meet them with rage. Meet them with proof, with calm, with truth. Because in the end, truth always outlasts noise. And peace. Peace is the sound that returns when the noise is finally gone. If you made it this far, comment "The Valley is free" below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories where karma does its job.